In this video, I'll mention a few important aspects of the philosophy of science related to this topic. To begin, I'd like to pose a question that comes from the recent book by John Lennox called Cosmic Chemistry. I'm sure that we would all agree that it's appropriate to ask whether intelligence was involved in the origin of the objects at the top of this slide. These are objects with parts that appear to be purposefully arranged, an image of the faces of well-known presidents of the U.S., writing that seems to contain a complex message, or signals from outer space. If that's the case, then why not also ask the same question for the objects on the bottom of the slide? A molecular machine called the bacterial flagellum, the genetic code, a gear structure found in insects, and a diagram describing at a high level the genetic regulatory network of the cell cycle of a species of bacteria called Colibacter. Interestingly, some scientists would agree that that's a fair question, whereas others would say that it's not appropriate. In fact, the official position of Western science is that that question is forbidden. In this video, we'll understand why. All these entities seem to be examples of informational discontinuities. That is, information content beyond the reach of chance or natural law, which leads us to conclude that they were designed. That conclusion is clearly appropriate for the top set of images, but many would say that the same logic should not be applied for the entities in the bottom set of images. To delve into this further, I find it useful to use diagrams. This slide shows diagrams that illustrate two perspectives on the relationship between science and worldviews or beliefs related to origins. The left side is what I would call a philosophically open view. In this view, science, represented by the red arrow, is just a methodology to learn about the natural world. The blue boxes represent the possibilities that something or someone exists outside of nature, or that nature is all there is. By nature, I mean space, time, matter, energy, and natural laws. In this view, we're all on the side of science, and it's possible for science to point to either conclusion. On the right is a perspective that is very common among scientists and highly educated people in the Western world. This view perceives the debate in terms of dichotomies: rational versus irrational, objective versus subjective, naturalism versus theism, and science versus religion. The most important aspect is that science can only be on one side. In this view, inferring design by an agent outside of nature is always unscientific. In a moment, I'll explain where this view comes from. Coming back to the first diagram, or the philosophically open perspective, the explanatory tools available to explain things we observe are natural laws, chance, and intelligent agents such as humans, animals, or aliens should they exist. Intelligence is clearly an explanatory tool that is needed for understanding some objects or entities that we observe. For example, most people would conclude that humans are the cause of most of the objects in the top section of the first slide, although signals from space might come from aliens should they exist. But if it's the case that there really are one or more causes outside of nature, then we may observe things in our universe that cannot be explained by some combination of natural law and chance, or by humans or animals, and may be very difficult to explain even by extraterrestrial intelligent agents, should they exist. Then the question arises as to whether an intelligence outside of nature can be invoked. There are things that minds can do that unintelligent causes cannot do. For example, intelligent agents plan, engineer, design. They think ahead. They arrange parts for a purpose. They can fix values of constants, conceive of laws, patterns, or principles. For example, think about a video game designer. To get to the heart of the matter, this slide shows a quote from a very influential biologist from Harvard who passed away recently. He was a senior figure in the biological community in the U.S. Reviewing a book by Carl Sagan, Richard Lewontin wrote, "We have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Richard Lewontin didn't have the perspective shown on the right-hand side of the prior slide, what I call the philosophically open perspective. Rather, he argued that materialism must be absolute and that we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. In other words, he removed the other blue box such that it's no longer allowed as a possibility to be considered. When I read this for the first time, I was really surprised. Many questions came to my mind. What's wrong with a divine foot in the door? Why is that a problem? It doesn't bother me. Why does it bother him? If that's the truth, then so be it. Why would he say that he can't allow it? And whose job is it to decide that for the rest of society? Who are we referred to in this quote? And what does cannot allow mean? The quote from Richard Lewontin expresses a principle called methodological naturalism. Most people are unaware of this, but this principle is held strictly by the scientific community in the U.S. and in most of the Western world. I've tried to illustrate this principle using these diagrams. The principle of methodological naturalism holds that the natural world must be complete, that there can be no incompleteness within the natural world. If you Google the term methodological naturalism, you'll find this explanation. Methodological naturalism is a philosophical doctrine that states that scientific explanations should only use natural causes and should not reference God or other divine activity. It's a convention of science that aims to make science religiously neutral and separate from theology. What do you think about this? Does this principle make science religiously neutral? If the scientific establishment continues to hold to this principle, and if, in fact, materialism or naturalism is not true, then scientific discoveries showing or suggesting that natural explanations are inadequate will accumulate. In that case, scientists will have to choose between what seems to be impossible and what is unthinkable, a cause outside of nature. Given that choice, a committed materialist will choose what seems to be impossible and hope or have faith that naturalistic solutions will eventually be found. In addition, those discoveries will be awkward or uncomfortable for the materialists, and they may avoid communicating them to the public. I think this is the case today in many areas covered by these videos. It's common to hear the argument that something could be discovered in the future to explain a mystery such as the origin of life naturalistically. The argument is that the conclusion of design, a designer outside of nature, should only be considered after we've done an infinite search. But of course, we can never do an infinite search in science. Moreover, that's not the way we normally reason in science and in our daily lives. For example, we don't believe that a cow can jump over the moon, but we haven't done an infinite search of all the possibilities. There could be a quirk of physics discovered someday that could explain it. But all the data and everything we know points against it, so most people would accept that conclusion despite the lack of an infinite search. If we find such a principle, or if we observe a cow actually jumping over the moon, then we'll change our views. Scientific conclusions are always tentative. Realize that if methodological naturalism is imposed, and if a mind really was involved, then one could never discover the truth. I think that most of the public believes that science should be an unbiased search for the truth. Coming back to this diagram, the philosophically open view, a concern should be the realization that bias can exist on both sides. Here is an example of bias on the side of naturalism or materialism. This is a statement from a scientist in the journal Nature, which is one of the most highly regarded scientific journals in the world. He said, "Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. For some people, no amount of evidence could ever be enough to conclude design. For such people, the data are irrelevant because the principle holds no matter what evidence exists. However, the amount of evidence required to conclude design is really a personal decision. In this series of videos, I'll show many examples of findings of science that have led many scientists to conclude that design is real, while others still hold to naturalism despite the evidence. An important point that I want to make is that if the public simply follows the beliefs of mainstream science in this area, then that very important decision is made for them by others who may hold very different philosophical views. A main goal of mine is to inform the public of some of the most relevant findings of science so that the decision will be in their own hands, not made for them or imposed on them by others. Another good example of bias within materialism or naturalism is the exhibit on the origin of life at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science. The exhibit shows molecules coming out of a volcano and then aggregating and generating a molecule of DNA, 2 strands forming the double helix. The panel in front contains the equation gas plus energy equals DNA. with an arrow indicating that life then follows. There is not now, nor has there ever been, any data to support that statement. Gas plus energy doesn't lead to or make DNA. Notice that it's not written as an hypothesis, but as an equation with an equal sign. Also, DNA by itself does absolutely nothing. It certainly doesn't make or constitute life. So where did this exhibit come from? If it's not based on scientific data, where did it come from? This is a clear example that belief in materialism can lead to misrepresentation of the data of science. Of course, bias can exist within theism, or belief that there's a mind outside of nature that is the ultimate cause of the universe. Theists can adopt beliefs based on their traditions or sacred writings, and hold them regardless of the data of science. This slide shows some passages from the Bible that led some Christians in the past to believe in geocentrism. When Copernicus claimed that the earth goes around the sun, some influential Christians soundly rejected that based on their interpretation of these texts. Clearly, the data of science can be trumped by beliefs on both sides. So when speaking about science, I strongly advocate that the data of science should be the arbiter. As in this famous quote by Richard Feynman, experiment is the sole judge of scientific truth. I hope I'm not wrong, but I think that the majority of people of all viewpoints would support that statement. This is the perspective of proponents of intelligent design at the Discovery Institute. A couple of important questions to think about are, can science function if we allow both possibilities? Actually, since the modern scientific method arose from Christian theism, it's clear that science can function and thrive with both possibilities. Another question is, will science be better served if we allow both possibilities? Finally, I want to address the common claim that inferring design is simply inserting God when there's a gap in our understanding. Concluding design based on informational discontinuities in nature is not a God of the gaps fallacy, but rather it's an inference to the best explanation. In our experience, whenever we see objects or entities that contain a high density of information, they always come from a mind. So we know that a mind is a sufficient cause for informational discontinuities. Inferring design is simply recognizing the only known cause capable of explaining the phenomenon. It's very disturbing to some people to think that there might be objective evidence of the influence of a mind outside of nature that we can discover in our world. I'm convinced that that's the case, but this is a personal decision that should be made by each individual.